There comes a point in your journey where the way people perceive you begins to quietly fracture. Not because you made a dramatic announcement or demanded to be seen differently, but because your actions have started to move beyond the limits they once placed on you. And what makes this moment so powerful is that it doesn't arrive with noise or recognition at first. It unfolds subtly, through a series of moments where you do something they didn't expect, where you overcome something they assumed would hold you back, where you respond in ways that no longer match the version of you they have been holding on to. And at the beginning, they try to rationalize it. They tell themselves it's temporary, that it's just a phase, that somehow what you're doing can still be explained within the boundaries of who they believe you are. But as it continues, as your actions begin to stack, as the results become consistent, that explanation starts to break down. Because people rely on predictability to feel comfortable. They rely on knowing how far someone can go, how someone will react, what someone is capable of achieving. And when you begin to move outside of that predictability, it creates a kind of tension they don't immediately understand. Because now they are facing something they can't easily categorize, something that doesn't follow the logic they are used to. And this is where the shift becomes undeniable. Because what once felt explainable now starts to feel almost unreal to them. Not because what you're doing is actually impossible, but because it exists outside the mental framework they built around you. And this is why the energy around you changes. Because people are no longer just observing what you do. They are reacting to what it represents. The fact that the limits they believed were fixed are no longer applying to you. And that realization creates a deeper reaction, one that goes beyond curiosity. Because when someone begins to consistently break expectations, it forces others to question their own assumptions, their own boundaries, their own understanding of what is possible. And not everyone is ready for that. So instead, they watch, they observe, they try to decode your behavior, to understand how you are doing what you are doing. But every time they think they are getting close, you move again. You shift again. You do something that breaks their interpretation. And this is where you become unexplainable in their eyes. Not because you are trying to be mysterious, but because you are no longer operating within the same limits they are using to understand the world. And as this realization begins to settle in, not just for them, but for you as well, everything starts to change. Because you begin to see that what you are doing is not random. It is not luck. It is not a series of isolated moments. It is a pattern of movement, a way of thinking, a level of awareness that is allowing you to navigate beyond constraints that once felt real. And this is where the true shift begins. Because once you recognize that, once you understand that you are no longer bound by the same expectations, you step into a completely different way of moving through your life. One where you are no longer trying to fit inside what others believe you are, but instead, operating from what you now know you can become. And as you begin to fully grasp the weight of this shift, as you start to recognize that the way people see you is no longer aligned with who you are becoming, it becomes necessary to go back. Not to stay in the past, but to understand how that version of you was created in the first place. Because the image people hold of you did not appear randomly. It was built slowly, piece by piece, through observation, through repetition, through patterns they witnessed over time. And without even realizing it, they studied you. They learned how you responded under pressure, how you handled challenges, how you moved when things were uncertain. And from those observations, they constructed a version of you that felt complete in their minds. A version that had limits, that had predictable reactions, that had a certain range of capability. And once that image was formed, they locked it in place. Not out of intention to restrict you, but out of their need for consistency. Because people rely on stable interpretations to navigate their interactions. They need to feel like they understand the people around them, like they can anticipate behavior, like they can predict outcomes. And this is what creates comfort. This is what allows them to move through relationships and environments without constantly reassessing everything. And you became part of that system, part of that structure, where your identity, in their eyes, was no longer fluid. It was fixed. It was defined by what they had already seen, by what you had already shown. And this is where the limitation begins. Not because you were incapable of more, but because their perception stopped evolving with you. It remained anchored to a version of you that no longer represented your full capacity. And this is something that happens quietly, without confrontation, without announcement. Because no one tells you that they have placed you inside a mental box. No one says out loud that they have decided how far you can go. But you feel it over time. In the way opportunities are presented to you, in the way people speak to you, in the way your potential is subtly framed within boundaries that feel just slightly too small. And at first, this may not stand out, because it aligns with your own patterns at the time. It reflects the version of you that you were still growing out of. And this is why it feels normal, why it goes unnoticed. Because your internal state and their external perception are aligned, both operating within the same range, the same expectations, the same understanding of what is possible. But growth does not remain still. Awareness does not stay contained. And as you begin to evolve, as you begin to see more, think differently, respond differently, that alignment begins to break. Not all at once, but gradually, as your internal state starts to move beyond the version they are still holding on to. And this is where the tension begins. Because while you are expanding, while you are stepping into a different level of awareness, their perception remains fixed. It does not update at the same pace. It does not automatically adjust to reflect who you are becoming. And this creates a gap, a difference between how you see yourself and how they continue to see you. And this gap is what sets the stage for everything that follows. Because when you begin to act from your new level, when you begin to make decisions that reflect your growth, when you begin to move in ways that are no longer consistent with their expectations, it challenges the image they have constructed. It disrupts the sense of predictability they rely on. And this is where the initial resistance can appear. Not necessarily as direct opposition, but as subtle doubt, as hesitation, as a kind of quiet disbelief that shows up in small ways, in the way they question your decisions, in the way they react with surprise when you succeed in something they didn't expect, in the way they try to interpret your actions through the lens of who you used to be, rather than who you are becoming. And this is where many people unconsciously slow down, where they begin to second-guess themselves, where they feel the pressure to remain consistent with the expectations placed on them, because stepping outside of that image can feel uncomfortable. It can feel like you are disrupting something stable, something familiar, something that others rely on to understand you. But this is exactly where your transformation requires you to move forward, not backward. Because the image they created was never meant to define you permanently. It was only a reflection of a moment in time, a snapshot of who you were at a certain stage of your journey. And holding on to it beyond that stage is what creates limitation. Not because the image itself is wrong, but because it is incomplete. It does not account for your growth, your awareness, your potential to move beyond what has already been seen. And this is where your awareness becomes crucial. Because you must recognize that the way others see you is not a final truth. It is a perspective based on past information. And while it may feel powerful, while it may influence how they interact with you, it does not define what you are capable of now. And this understanding is what allows you to begin stepping outside of that image. not by forcing others to change their perception, but by changing your alignment, by acting from your current level rather than your past one. And this is where the shift begins to take form. Because each time you make a decision that reflects your growth, each time you respond in a way that is not consistent with the old pattern, each time you move beyond what was expected of you, you weaken the hold of that image. You introduce new information, new evidence that challenges the fixed perception. And while this does not immediately replace the old image, it begins to destabilize it. It creates cracks. Small at first, but significant. Because once a perception is challenged consistently, it cannot remain unchanged forever. And this is where your consistency becomes your greatest tool. Not consistency in repeating old patterns, but consistency in embodying your new level. Because the more you operate from this place, the more undeniable it becomes. The harder it is for others to maintain the old version of you in their minds. And this is where the transformation becomes visible, not just internally, but externally, as the way people respond to you begins to shift, as their expectations begin to adjust, as the image they once held is forced to evolve. And this process is not always immediate. It is not always smooth, because perception takes time to change, especially when it has been reinforced over a long period. But it is inevitable when your actions consistently contradict the old narrative. And this is what you are stepping into now. A phase where you are no longer aligning yourself with the version of you that others created, but with the version of you that you have become. And this alignment is what allows you to move freely, to operate without being confined by outdated expectations, to continue expanding without feeling the need to fit back into something that no longer represents you. And as you continue on this path, you will see that the image they once locked in place will either evolve to match your growth or become irrelevant. Because once you step fully into your new level, there is no returning to the limitations that once defined you. Only moving forward into a space where your actions, your awareness, and your identity are no longer shaped by past perception, but by present alignment and future potential. And as this realization begins to settle deeper within you, as you come to understand that the version of you others created was never meant to define your full capacity, there is a moment, often quiet and almost unnoticeable at first, where something inside you begins to shift in a way that changes everything. Not externally in a way that others can immediately see, but internally, in a way that alters how you think, how you process, how you respond. And this is where the real transformation begins. Because without needing to announce it, without needing to prove it, you start moving differently. You start making decisions that no longer align with the old image. You begin to think in ways that are not limited by what has already been experienced. And this shift is subtle at first, so subtle that even you may not fully recognize its significance in the moment, because it does not feel like a dramatic breakthrough. It feels like a quiet clarity, like a new perspective that suddenly makes more sense than the old one, like a realization that certain limitations were never as fixed as they appeared. And this is where you begin stepping outside of the frame others placed you in, not by rejecting it directly, but by outgrowing it naturally. Because growth does not always come with resistance. Sometimes it comes with a sense of ease, with a natural movement towards something that feels more aligned, more accurate, more reflective of who you are becoming. And this is what starts to separate your internal state from external perception. Because while others are still holding on to the version of you that fits within their understanding, you are already operating from a different level, one that they have not yet seen enough of to fully recognize. And this creates a kind of disconnect, not necessarily conflict, but a misalignment between how you see yourself and how they continue to interpret you. And this is where your actions begin to carry a different weight, because they are no longer guided by the need to remain consistent with past expectations. They are guided by your current awareness, by your evolving understanding of what is possible. And this is what makes your movement unpredictable from the outside. Because you are no longer following the patterns that once made you easy to understand. You are not reacting in ways that can be anticipated based on previous behavior. You are responding from a place that is new, that is still forming, that is not yet fully mapped by those observing you. And this is where the first signs of confusion begin to appear in others. Because they start to notice that something is different, even if they cannot clearly define what it is. They begin to sense that your responses are not aligning with what they expected, that your decisions are not following the same logic they are used to. And at first, they try to interpret it through the lens they already have. They try to fit your new behavior into the old framework, to explain it in a way that maintains their sense of understanding. But as it continues, as your actions consistently move outside of that framework, that explanation begins to fail. Because there is only so much new behavior that can be forced into an old understanding before it no longer makes sense. And this is where the shift becomes more visible. Because what once felt like a small difference now begins to stand out more clearly. In the way you approach challenges, in the way you handle situations that would have once triggered familiar responses, in the way you move forward without the hesitation or limitation that once defined your actions. And this is where your growth becomes undeniable. Not because you are trying to show it, but because it is being expressed naturally through how you operate. And this is what makes it so powerful. Because it is not something that can be easily dismissed or explained away. It is consistent. It is grounded. It is reflected in multiple areas of your life. And this consistency is what begins to challenge the old image others have of you. Because it introduces a level of unpredictability that cannot be ignored. And unpredictability, while often misunderstood, is not about being chaotic. It is about no longer being confined to a single pattern. It is about having the ability to respond based on awareness rather than habit. And this is what you are developing, even if you are not consciously labeling it that way. You are learning to move beyond automatic responses, beyond conditioned thinking, beyond the need to follow what has already been established. And this is what allows you to create new outcomes. Because when you are no longer repeating the same internal patterns, you are no longer reinforcing the same external results. And this is where your path begins to diverge from what others expect. Because they are still using past information to predict your future, while you are operating from a present awareness that is no longer tied to that past. And this difference is what creates the gap between their understanding and your reality. And this gap is what makes your actions appear almost unexplainable from their perspective, because they are trying to understand something new using outdated information. And this is why your movement feels like it is slipping outside of their logic, because it is. You are no longer operating within the same framework, and this is where your confidence begins to shift as well. Not in a loud or exaggerated way, but in a quiet, steady way that comes from recognizing that you are capable of more than what was previously defined. That you are not limited by the patterns that once shaped your behavior. That you can choose differently, move differently, respond differently. And this recognition is what allows you to continue stepping outside of that old image without needing external validation. Because you are no longer waiting for others to update their perception before you move forward. You are moving based on your own awareness, your own understanding. your own alignment with who you are becoming. And this is what creates momentum. Because each time you act from this place, you reinforce it. You strengthen the separation between who you were and who you are now. And this separation is what allows the new version of you to take form more clearly, more consistently, more fully. And as this continues, the disconnect between you and the old image becomes too large to ignore. Because the evidence of your growth is no longer isolated. It is repeated. It is visible. It is undeniable. And this is where others are forced to adjust. Not because you ask them to, but because the reality of your actions leaves no other option. And this is what marks the transition into a new phase, where you are no longer partially inside the old frame, but fully outside of it, operating from a place that is defined by your current awareness rather than your past patterns. And this is what sets the stage for everything that follows. Because once you step outside of the frame, once you begin to move beyond what others expected, you are no longer limited by their perception. You are guided by your own. And that is what allows you to continue expanding in ways that once seemed impossible. Not because the world has changed, but because you have changed how you engage with it. And that change is what redefines what is possible for you moving forward. And as you continue to move from this new level of awareness, as your decisions and actions consistently reflect a version of you that is no longer confined to the expectations built around your past, something even more noticeable begins to happen. Something that goes beyond subtle shifts and begins to challenge the very way others interpret reality around you. Because now, it is no longer just that you are different. It is that what you do no longer follows the logic they are used to. And this is where the tension deepens. Because people rely on patterns not only to understand individuals, but to understand outcomes. They rely on cause and effect that feels familiar, on sequences that make sense based on what they have already seen. And when your actions begin to produce results that do not match those expected sequences, it disrupts more than just their perception of you. It disrupts their sense of how things are supposed to work. And this is what makes your movement feel so difficult for them to process, because they are trying to apply a framework that no longer fits what you are doing. They are using past behavior to predict present outcomes. And when those predictions fail repeatedly, it creates a kind of cognitive tension that cannot be easily resolved. Because their logic tells them one thing should happen, but your actions consistently lead to something else. And this is where your presence begins to take on that almost unexplainable quality. Not because what you are doing defies reality, but because it defies the version of reality they have become comfortable with. And this is where you begin to notice the shift, not just in their reactions, but in their attention. Because people start watching you more closely, not out of simple curiosity, but out of a need to understand, to decode, to find a pattern they can hold on to. And yet every time they think they have identified it, you move in a way that breaks it again. Because your actions are no longer based on repetition. They are based on awareness, on presence, on a level of adaptability that cannot be easily mapped by past data. And this is what makes you unpredictable in the best sense. Not chaotic, not inconsistent, but free from the rigid patterns that once made your behavior easy to anticipate. And this freedom is what allows you to respond to situations in ways that are more aligned, more precise, more effective. Because you are not constrained by what has already been done. You are not limited by what is expected. You are operating in real time, making decisions based on clarity rather than habit. And this is what creates outcomes that feel impossible to those who are still operating within fixed patterns. Because from their perspective, you are skipping steps. You are bypassing limitations. You are achieving results without following the process they believe is required. And this is where the comparison begins to form in their minds. Not as something they fully articulate, but as a feeling, a recognition that what you are doing resembles something beyond their current understanding. Something that feels almost like an illusion, like a trick, like a performance that they cannot fully see through. And this is why the image of you as someone who does the impossible begins to take shape. Not because you are intentionally creating that impression, but because their framework for understanding success, growth, and movement no longer applies to what they are witnessing. And this is where your awareness becomes even more important. Because while others may interpret your actions as something mysterious or unexplainable, you must remain grounded in the understanding that what you are doing is not magic. It is alignment. It is clarity. It is the result of removing the internal resistance that once slowed you down. And this understanding is what keeps you stable. What prevents you from becoming distracted by how others perceive you? Because the moment you start trying to match their interpretation, the moment you begin to perform according to their expectations of what you are now, you risk losing the very alignment that allows you to move this way. And this is why your focus must remain internal, on your awareness, on your clarity, on your ability to continue responding from a place that is not influenced by external perception. Because the more you stay aligned, the more consistent your results become. And this consistency is what further reinforces the shift, not just for you, but for those observing you. Because over time, what once felt like an anomaly begins to feel like a pattern, a new pattern that challenges their previous understanding. And this is where the transformation becomes undeniable, because it is no longer a series of isolated moments. It is a sustained way of operating, a consistent level of movement that cannot be dismissed as coincidence. And this is where the deeper impact begins to unfold. Because when people are repeatedly exposed to something that does not fit their existing framework, they are forced to either expand their understanding or reject what they are seeing. And both responses create a shift. Because even rejection requires acknowledgement. It requires them to recognize that something is different, that something does not fit. And this is where your presence begins to influence more than just your own path. It begins to challenge the assumptions of those around you, to introduce the possibility that what they believed to be fixed may not be as fixed as they thought. And this is what creates that mixture of curiosity and discomfort. Because while some may feel inspired by what you are doing, others may feel unsettled. Not because of you directly, but because of what your actions represent. The breaking of limits, the rewriting of expectations, the demonstration that what was once considered impossible may simply have been misunderstood. And this is where your journey takes on a deeper significance, because it is no longer just about your own growth. It is about the ripple effect of that growth, the way it influences perception, the way it challenges norms, the way it opens space for new possibilities to be considered. And this is why it is so important to remain grounded, to stay connected to your awareness, to continue moving with intention rather than reaction. Because the more aligned you are, the more clearly this new pattern will establish itself. Not just in your life, but in the way it is perceived and understood by those around you. And as this continues, you will find that what once felt like impossible becomes your new normal. Not because the actions themselves have changed, but because your understanding of them has deepened. Because you are no longer measuring them against old limitations. You are experiencing them as natural outcomes of your current alignment. And this is what ultimately redefines everything. Because once something becomes normal to you, once it becomes integrated into how you move and operate, it loses the sense of impossibility. It becomes part of your baseline, part of your standard. And this is where the true shift lies. Not in doing something extraordinary once, but in making what once felt extraordinary a consistent part of how you live. And as you continue to embody this, you will find that the gap between how others perceive you and how you understand yourself becomes less relevant. Because your focus is no longer on how it appears, but on how it aligns, on how it feels, on how it continues to move you forward in a way that is no longer constrained by what once defined your limits. And this is what ultimately allows you to continue evolving, to continue expanding, to continue moving in ways that may still feel unexplainable to others, but are completely natural to you. Because you are no longer operating within their logic. You are operating within your own awareness. And that is what makes all the difference. And as this gap between how you move and how others understand you continues to widen, as your actions repeatedly defy the expectations that once made you predictable, there comes a phase where the attention around you begins to intensify in a way that is impossible to ignore. Because what started as quiet observation slowly evolves into focused scrutiny. Not always obvious, not always spoken, but present in the way people look at you a little longer. In the way conversations carry an undercurrent of curiosity. In the way your movements are being tracked, remembered, and revisited in their minds. And this is where you begin to realize that people are no longer just noticing that you are different. They are actively trying to understand how and why. Because when something consistently operates outside of expectation, it naturally draws attention. Not just admiration, but analysis. Because the human mind seeks patterns. It seeks explanations. It seeks to reduce the unknown into something manageable. And you have become, in their perspective, something that does not easily reduce. Something that resists being simplified. And this is what creates that feeling of being watched more closely. Not necessarily in a negative sense, but in a way that reflects the shift in how they are processing you. Because now, every move you make carries more weight. Every decision becomes part of a larger attempt to decode your behavior, to find consistency, to establish a pattern that can bring you back into a framework they understand. And yet, the more they watch, the more they realize that what you are doing cannot be easily mapped. Because each time they think they have identified a pattern, you shift again. Not randomly, not unpredictably in a chaotic way, but in a way that reflects your alignment, your awareness, your ability to respond in the moment rather than repeat what has already been done. And this is what makes their attempts to decode you increasingly difficult. Because they are looking for repetition. While you are operating from presence, they are trying to predict based on past behavior. While you are making decisions based on current awareness. And this mismatch is what creates the illusion that you are slipping through their understanding. Like something they almost grasp but never fully hold. And this is where the comparison begins to solidify even further. Because from their perspective, it feels like you are always one step ahead. Like you are navigating in a way that bypasses the usual constraints. And this is what leads to that sense of you being impossible to figure out. Not because you are intentionally hiding anything, but because you are no longer operating within a system that can be easily analyzed using familiar tools. And this is where your awareness must deepen even more. Because while it may be tempting to respond to this attention, to explain yourself, to make your actions more understandable, to reduce the tension that comes from being observed in this way, doing so would pull you back toward the very patterns you have stepped beyond. Because explanation often requires simplification, and simplification can lead to limitation. And this is why your strength in this phase comes not from trying to be understood, but from remaining aligned. From continuing to move in a way that is true to your awareness, rather than reactive to external observation. And this is where your presence becomes even more powerful. Because you are not just doing things differently, you are holding a position that does not depend on how others interpret you. You are grounded in your own understanding, in your own clarity, in your own alignment. And this grounded presence is what creates a different kind of energy around you. One that is felt even when it is not fully understood. One that influences interactions without needing to be explained. And this is what makes your movement so impactful, because it is not driven by the need for validation. It is driven by alignment. And alignment has a consistency that does not need to repeat the same actions to remain stable. It adapts. It responds. It evolves. And this is what allows you to continue moving forward without becoming predictable again. Because predictability comes from repetition, while your movement comes from awareness. And awareness is always adjusting, always responding to the present moment, always choosing based on what is aligned rather than what is familiar. And this is what keeps you just beyond the reach of their understanding. Not in a way that isolates you, but in a way that reflects your growth. Because you are no longer confined to a fixed identity. You are not bound to a single way of operating. You are fluid. You are adaptive. You are able to move in ways that are not limited by what has already been established. And this is what creates that ongoing sense of mystery from the outside. Because they are trying to define something that is still evolving, something that does not remain static long enough to be fully captured. And this is where your awareness must remain steady. Because the more attention you receive, the greater the temptation can be to adjust your behavior in response to it, to become more conscious of how you are being perceived, to alter your movement in a way that either fits expectations or avoids scrutiny. But this is where your growth is tested, because true alignment is not influenced by observation. It is not dependent on how others respond. It remains consistent regardless of external attention. And this is what ensures that your path continues to unfold in a way that is authentic, in a way that is not shaped by the need to be understood or accepted, but by the clarity of your own awareness. And as you continue to hold this position, you will find that the intensity of observation begins to shift as well. Because over time, what once felt unexplainable begins to establish its own form of consistency. Not in the sense of becoming predictable, but in the sense of becoming recognized as a pattern of alignment, as a way of operating that, while still not fully understood, is no longer seen as random or temporary. And this is where the perception around you begins to evolve, because people start to accept that what you are doing is not a fluke, not a coincidence, but a reflection of something deeper. Something stable within you that allows you to move this way consistently. And this is where the dynamic changes again, because the focus shifts from trying to decode you to acknowledging that you operate differently. And this acknowledgement, even if it is not fully understood, creates space for a new kind of interaction. One that is not based on trying to fit you into an old framework, but on recognizing that you no longer operate within it. And this is what ultimately allows you to move forward without resistance, without the need to constantly prove or explain. Because your consistency in alignment becomes your proof. Your clarity becomes your explanation. And as you continue on this path, you will find that the need to be understood fades. Not because understanding is unimportant, but because it is no longer necessary for you to move forward. And this is what gives you a level of freedom that goes beyond external perception. Because you are no longer navigating based on how you are seen, You are navigating based on how you are aligned. And that is what allows you to continue evolving, to continue moving in ways that may still feel unexplainable to others, but are completely natural to you. Because you are no longer trying to be decoded. You are simply being aligned. And as this state of alignment becomes more natural to you, as your movements continue to flow from awareness rather than habit, there is a shift that becomes increasingly visible, not just in how you move, but in what you are able to accomplish. Because what once required effort, hesitation, or even doubt, now begins to unfold with a level of precision and ease that feels almost unfamiliar at first. And this is where the perception around you begins to intensify even further. Because people are no longer just observing that you are different, they are now witnessing results that challenge their understanding of what is possible. And this is where the narrative begins to change from curiosity to something deeper. Because when someone repeatedly achieves what others consider difficult, unlikely, or even unrealistic, it forces a comparison that is not always comfortable. And this is where the idea begins to form in their minds that what you are doing is not just unusual, but impossible. Not in the literal sense, but in the sense that it exists outside of their current framework, outside of what they believe can be done under normal conditions. And this is what creates that powerful shift in perception. Because from your perspective, what you are doing feels aligned. It feels natural. It feels like the result of clarity and awareness. But from their perspective, it looks effortless in a way that does not match the difficulty they associate with those outcomes. And this is where the illusion begins to take shape. Because when effort is no longer visible, when struggle is no longer apparent, the result appears disconnected from the process. And this disconnect is what makes it feel like something beyond explanation. And this is where it becomes essential for you to remain grounded in your understanding. Because what you are experiencing is not the absence of effort. It is the absence of resistance. It is the result of no longer carrying the internal barriers that once made those actions feel heavy. And this is what allows you to move with that level of precision. Because you are not dividing your energy between action and doubt, between movement and hesitation. You are fully aligned with what you are doing. And this alignment is what creates efficiency, what creates clarity, what allows you to execute in a way that appears seamless from the outside. And this is where the misunderstanding often occurs, because people tend to associate ease with luck, with natural talent, with something that cannot be learned or developed. But what they are not seeing is the process that led to this point, the awareness you have built, the patterns you have broken, the internal alignment you have established. And this is why their interpretation remains incomplete, because they are only seeing the result, not the foundation that supports it. And this is where your awareness must remain clear. Because the moment you begin to internalize their interpretation, the moment you start to see what you are doing as something extraordinary, in a way that separates you from the process that created it, you risk losing the very alignment that allows you to operate this way. And this is why it is so important to stay connected to the truth of your movement, to recognize that what appears effortless is the result of clarity, that what appears impossible is the result of alignment, and that what appears like a sudden shift is actually the outcome of everything you have been building over time. And this understanding is what keeps you grounded, what allows you to continue moving without being influenced by external perception. Because you are not trying to live up to the idea of being extraordinary. You are simply continuing to operate from a place that is no longer limited by the patterns you have already moved beyond. And this is what allows your results to remain consistent, because they are not driven by pressure or expectation. They are driven by alignment. And alignment does not fluctuate based on how it is perceived. It remains steady as long as you remain connected to it. And this is where your confidence deepens in a way that is not reactive, not dependent on outcomes, but rooted in your understanding of how you are moving. Because you begin to trust the process, not in a passive way, but in an active way, where you know that as long as you remain aligned, your actions will continue to produce results that reflect that alignment. And this is what allows you to approach challenges differently, not with the weight of expectation or the fear of difficulty, but with the clarity that comes from knowing that you are not bound by the same limitations that once made those challenges feel overwhelming. And this is what creates that sense of you doing the impossible. Because you are no longer approaching situations from the same level of resistance. You are not engaging with the same internal barriers. You are not reinforcing the same doubts or hesitations. And this is what allows you to move through situations that others may find difficult with a level of ease that feels almost unnatural to them. And this is where the perception of you begins to shift even further. Because as these results continue to appear, as they become more consistent, more undeniable, the explanation of luck becomes less convincing. The idea of coincidence becomes harder to maintain. And this is where curiosity begins to transform into something more complex. Because now, people are not just trying to understand what you are doing. They are trying to understand how you are doing it consistently. And this is where the pressure of observation can increase. Because consistency challenges belief systems more than isolated success ever could. Because a single moment can be dismissed, but repeated outcomes force a re-evaluation. And this is where the dynamic around you begins to shift again. Because people are no longer just watching out of interest. They are watching because they recognize that something is different in a way that cannot be ignored. And this recognition can create a range of responses, from admiration to discomfort to even subtle resistance. Because when someone consistently operates outside of what is considered normal, it challenges the boundaries that others have accepted. And this challenge is not always easy to process. And this is where your role becomes even more important. Because you must remain anchored in your understanding, in your awareness, in your alignment, rather than being influenced by the reactions around you. Because the more consistent you are in your movement, the more stable your results become. And this stability is what eventually reshapes perception, not just of you, but of what is possible. And this is where your journey takes on a deeper significance, because it is no longer just about your own growth. It is about what your growth represents, the demonstration that limitations can be moved beyond, that patterns can be broken, that alignment can create outcomes that once seemed out of reach. And as you continue to embody this, you will find that what once felt like a breakthrough becomes your baseline, that what once felt like a rare moment becomes a consistent experience. And this is where the idea of impossible loses its meaning, not because the challenges disappear, but because your relationship to them has changed. Because you are no longer approaching them from a place of limitation, you are approaching them from a place of alignment. And that is what allows you to continue doing what others may still struggle to understand, not as something extraordinary, but as something that has become natural to you. And as this becomes your new normal, as the rhythm of your life begins to reflect a level of alignment that once felt distant, but now feels natural, there is a deeper shift that unfolds beneath the surface, one that is not immediately visible to others, but is profoundly felt within you. Because it is no longer just about what you are able to achieve or how others perceive your movement. It is about the transformation in how you relate to yourself, to your decisions, to the uncertainty that once created hesitation. And this is where the journey begins to move beyond external validation entirely. Because you start to recognize that the true power of your alignment is not in the results it produces, but in the stability it creates within you. A stability that does not fluctuate with outcomes, that does not depend on recognition, that remains steady even when circumstances shift. And this is what allows you to move through your life with a different kind of confidence. One that is not loud or performative, but quiet and grounded. Because it is rooted in understanding rather than comparison. And this understanding is what changes everything. Because you are no longer trying to prove anything, not to others, not even to yourself. You are simply operating from a place that you trust, a place that you have tested through experience, through consistency, through the repeated confirmation that when you remain aligned, your actions unfold with clarity. And this is what creates that sense of ease that others may interpret as effortless. Because you are no longer carrying the weight of doubt. You are no longer dividing your energy between what you are doing and what you fear might happen. You are fully present in your movement, fully engaged in the process. And this presence is what allows you to respond to challenges in a way that is not reactive, not driven by urgency or fear, but guided by awareness. And this is where the depth of your growth becomes evident, because it is not just in what you do, it is in how you respond when things do not go as expected. It is in your ability to remain steady when outcomes are uncertain, to remain clear when situations become complex, to remain aligned even when external conditions shift. And this is what truly sets your movement apart. Because while others may rely on conditions to determine their actions, you are able to maintain your alignment regardless of those conditions. And this is what creates that sense of you being unshakable. Not because nothing affects you, but because you have developed the ability to process what affects you without losing your center, without losing your clarity. And this is where your awareness becomes your greatest asset, because it allows you to observe without being consumed, to engage without becoming reactive, to move without being pulled back into patterns that no longer serve you. And this is what creates that consistency that others find so difficult to understand, because they are used to fluctuation, to movement that changes based on external factors, to decisions that are influenced by emotion, by pressure, by expectation. And when they see you maintain a steady course despite those same influences, it challenges their understanding of what is possible. Because it reveals that stability does not have to come from control. It can come from alignment. And this is where your journey begins to take on an even deeper significance. Because you are no longer just demonstrating what can be achieved. You are demonstrating how it can be sustained. How alignment can create not just results, but resilience. Not just movement, but consistency. And this is what allows you to continue evolving without losing your foundation. Because your growth is no longer built on temporary motivation or external validation. It is built on a deeper understanding of how you operate, of what keeps you aligned, of what allows you to move forward without being pulled back into old patterns. And this is what gives you a sense of freedom that goes beyond external circumstances. Because you are no longer dependent on things going a certain way to maintain your direction. You are able to adapt, to adjust, to respond without losing your sense of purpose. And this adaptability is what makes your movement so fluid, so responsive, so effective. Because you are not rigid. You are not fixed in a single approach. You are able to shift while remaining aligned, to change direction without losing clarity. And this is what allows you to navigate complexity with a level of ease that others may find difficult to replicate. Because you are not trying to control every variable. You are focusing on maintaining your alignment within whatever variables arise. And this is what creates that sense of flow, that sense of moving with rather than against the conditions around you. And this is where your confidence becomes even more grounded, because it is no longer based on what you have done, but on what you understand, on the knowledge that you can navigate whatever comes next because you trust your ability to remain aligned within it. And this trust is what removes the fear that once accompanied uncertainty, because you no longer see uncertainty as something that threatens your movement. You see it as something that invites your awareness, that requires your presence, that allows you to engage with a level of depth that would not be possible if everything were predictable. And this is what transforms the way you experience your journey. Because you are no longer seeking certainty, you are seeking alignment. And alignment allows you to move through uncertainty with clarity, with intention, with a sense of direction that is not dependent on having all the answers in advance. And this is what ultimately changes how you relate to everything. Because you are no longer measuring your progress by how predictable your path is, but by how aligned your movement remains. And as you continue to operate from this place, you will find that the reactions around you begin to shift once again. Because as your stability becomes more evident, as your consistency becomes more undeniable, the perception of you as someone who does the impossible begins to evolve into something more grounded, more recognized, because people start to see that what you are doing is not random. It is not based on chance. It is based on something deeper, something that they may not fully understand, but can no longer dismiss. And this is where respect begins to replace confusion, where acknowledgement begins to replace skepticism. And while not everyone will fully grasp how you operate, they will begin to recognize that there is a level of clarity and stability in your movement that sets you apart. And this recognition, even if it remains unspoken, changes the dynamic around you, because it creates space for your presence to be felt in a different way. Not as something that needs to be explained, but as something that is simply understood to be different. And this is what ultimately allows you to continue moving forward without resistance, without the need to justify or prove, because your alignment speaks for itself. Your consistency demonstrates what words cannot fully capture. And as you continue on this path, you will find that the question of whether something is possible or impossible becomes less relevant. Because you are no longer operating within that framework. You are operating within your awareness, within your alignment, within a way of moving that is not defined by limitation. And that is what allows you to continue evolving, to continue expanding, to continue stepping into levels of growth that may still appear extraordinary to others, but have become a natural extension of who you are. And as you continue to operate from this place of grounded alignment, as your movement becomes less about reaching something and more about expressing something that is already established within you, there comes a final shift that quietly redefines everything. A shift where the focus of your journey moves beyond proving, beyond achieving, beyond even being perceived in any particular way, and settles into a deeper understanding of purpose, because you begin to realize that what you have been building is not just a different way of acting, but a different way of being. And this realization changes the entire landscape of how you move forward. Because now, your actions are no longer driven by the desire to break limits or demonstrate what is possible. They are guided by the clarity of what feels aligned, of what feels true, of what continues to expand your awareness without pulling you back into patterns that no longer belong to you. And this is where your movement takes on a new level of refinement. Because you are no longer navigating through trial and error in the same way. You are no longer testing boundaries to see if they can be moved. You are operating from the understanding that those boundaries are already flexible, already responsive to your alignment. And this is what allows your actions to become more intentional, more precise, more focused. Because you are no longer expending energy on resistance. You are channeling it into direction, into creation, into the continuous unfolding of what you are becoming. And this is where your awareness becomes not just a tool, but a foundation. Something that supports every decision, every response, every movement. And this foundation is what allows you to remain steady even as your path continues to evolve. Because you are no longer anchored to a fixed destination. You are anchored to a way of moving that adapts with you, that grows with you, that expands as your understanding deepens. And this is what gives your journey a sense of continuity that is not dependent on outcomes. Because even when the external landscape changes, even when new challenges arise, your internal alignment remains constant. And this constancy is what allows you to move through change without losing direction, to embrace new opportunities without hesitation, to step into unfamiliar territory with a sense of clarity that is not based on knowing everything in advance, but on trusting your ability to navigate whatever unfolds. And this is where your relationship with uncertainty transforms completely. Because it is no longer something that creates tension or doubt. It becomes something that invites exploration, something that expands your awareness, something that allows you to engage with your journey in a way that is dynamic and alive, rather than rigid and controlled. And this is what ultimately allows you to continue evolving without resistance. Because you are no longer trying to hold on to a specific version of yourself. You are allowing yourself to become, to adapt, to refine, to expand in ways that are guided by alignment rather than expectation. And this is where the deeper impact of your journey becomes evident. Because as you embody this way of being, you begin to influence the space around you in ways that go beyond what you say or do. Because your presence itself carries a sense of clarity, a sense of stability, a sense of possibility that others can feel, even if they cannot fully explain it. And this is what creates that subtle but powerful ripple effect. Because when people encounter someone who operates from this level of alignment, it challenges them in a way that is not confrontational, but reflective. It invites them to question their own patterns, their own limitations, their own understanding of what is possible. And while not everyone will respond to that invitation in the same way, the presence of it alone creates a shift. Because it introduces the possibility of something different, something beyond what they have been used to. And this is where your journey becomes more than just a personal transformation. It becomes a reference point, a demonstration, a living example of what can happen when alignment replaces resistance, when awareness replaces habit, when clarity replaces doubt. And this is what gives your movement a sense of purpose that goes beyond individual achievement. Because it is not just about what you accomplish. It is about what your way of being represents. The idea that growth is not limited to external change, but rooted in internal alignment. And this understanding is what allows you to continue moving forward without becoming attached to how your journey is perceived. Because you are no longer seeking recognition or validation. You are simply expressing what you have become. And this expression is what creates consistency. Because it is not dependent on external factors. It is an extension of your alignment. And as you continue to embody this, you will find that the distinction between what once felt possible and impossible becomes irrelevant, because you are no longer operating within that framework. You are not measuring your actions against limitations. You are allowing them to emerge from alignment. And this is what ultimately frees you from the need to define your journey in those terms. Because you are no longer trying to prove that something can be done. You are simply doing what is aligned. And this is where the sense of effort transforms completely. Because it is no longer about pushing through resistance. It is about moving with clarity, about responding with awareness, about allowing your actions to unfold in a way that reflects your understanding. And this is what creates that sense of flow that others may still find difficult to grasp. Because it is not based on control, it is based on alignment. And alignment cannot be forced. It can only be recognized and maintained. And this is what allows you to continue evolving without losing your center, to continue expanding without becoming scattered, to continue growing without becoming disconnected from the foundation that supports you. And as this becomes more integrated into how you live, you will find that your journey no longer feels like a series of steps or stages, but like a continuous unfolding, a process that is always in motion, always adapting, always expanding. And this is what ultimately defines your path, not the milestones you reach, not the perceptions you create, but the way you move, the way you respond, the way you remain aligned, regardless of what changes around you. And this is what allows you to continue stepping into new levels of growth with a sense of ease that is not based on simplicity, but on clarity. Because you understand that as long as you remain aligned, as long as you continue to operate from awareness, your path will continue to unfold in a way that is true to you. And that is what makes all the difference. And as everything you have moved through begins to settle into a deeper understanding, as the noise of perception, expectation, and comparison fades into the background, what remains is something far more powerful than any label others may have tried to place on you. Because you begin to recognize that this journey was never about proving that you could do the impossible. It was about realizing that what once seemed impossible was only a reflection of limits that no longer apply to you. And this realization is what brings everything into focus, because it shifts your attention away from how things appear and anchors it into how you move, how you respond, how you remain aligned regardless of what unfolds around you. And this is where your clarity becomes unshakable. Not because life stops presenting challenges, but because your relationship with those challenges has changed in a way that allows you to meet them without hesitation, without the weight of doubt that once slowed you down. And this is what ultimately defines your path. Not the moments where others watched in disbelief, not the times when your actions seemed to break expectations, but the consistency with which you remain true to your alignment. Because that consistency is what transformed what once felt extraordinary into something that now feels natural, something that no longer needs to be questioned or explained. And as you continue forward, you will find that the need to be understood becomes less relevant, because your movement no longer depends on it. Your direction is no longer influenced by it. And this is where your freedom fully reveals itself, because you are no longer navigating within the limits of perception. You are moving within the clarity of your own awareness. And that clarity is what allows you to continue evolving without losing your foundation, to continue expanding without becoming disconnected from what brought you here. And this is what makes your journey sustainable, what makes it real, because it is not built on temporary moments of success, but on a way of being that continues to unfold with you. And as you embrace this fully, you will understand that there was never anything mystical about what you were doing, only a deeper level of alignment that you chose to step into. And that choice is what changed everything.